London Property, home of Super Prime, where you can find informative, educational and entertaining content covering all aspects of property.
Hello and welcome to the London Property Podcast. Today we're in conversation with Steve Varsano of the Jet Business. Thank you for having us. Hello, Steve.
Hello, thank you for having me.
So let's just give our listeners a bit of a background of how you got to be doing what you're doing today.
Well, I was quite young, actually. I started learning how to fly when I was 14 years old. From a friend's older brother took me up for an airplane ride, and I fell in love with it. And then I ended up going into university to get a degree in aeronautical studies. And then I became a lobbyist on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. to represent the airplane manufacturers, which was a great job, a great ego boost, but lousy money. So at nighttime, I worked in a nightclub, and I met somebody there who sold jets. He had a little jet on his tie pin when they had ties and pins. And I got to meet him, and he started coming and showing off his commission checks every few weeks or a month and how much he was making. So I convinced them to hire me to sell planes, and that was many, many years ago.
And today you represent buyers and sellers in selling private jets. And before we get into that, so I suppose there is only a handful of people who actually produce the jets. So just a little bit of education for our listeners. So are private jets made by the same people who make the jets that we all fly commercially? Yeah,
there's a small handful of manufacturers. They're called OEMs, original equipment manufacturers, that make airplanes for the corporate world. So there's Cessna, there's Gulfstream, there's Dassault Falcon, there's Bombardier, there's Embraer Legacy, and then you move up to the Boeing and the Airbus. So those are really the manufacturers that make the airplanes for a very small market. I mean, about 600 or 700 new jets a year are actually inputted into the system.
Okay, and so there's the second-hand market and then the new market. And the customers for these are generally corporates. So your business is in both. You're doing both selling new jets for the manufacturers, or do you only trade existing jets?
Yeah, most of the time our business is buying and selling the pre-owned aircraft. Since the new aircraft it's a smaller market, the pre-owned aircraft market's about 5 or 6 times more active than the new aircraft market. And it's harder to find the airplanes and import them and export them through different places. So our services are needed much more by buyers and sellers than a new aircraft manufacturer who could deliver a brand new airplane with, off the factory floor. So there's no guesswork of maintenance and history and things like that. So that's where our value gets added into the figure.
Okay, and so basically, from a buyer's perspective, when they're coming to look at a jet, I suppose you need to, if they don't have the experience, you need to do a little bit of educating on what they should be considering and what are the do's and don'ts.
Yeah, a lot of people don't really know which jet they need, and they're really not educated in that field. It's a very small world to be in, and unless you've actually been flying privately, it's hard to know. And of course, it's very difficult to sell a very successful, wealthy, powerful person that you don't know what you're talking about. And you don't want to insult them. So we have actually developed our own app, our own technology on this giant video wall we have here in our showroom that takes people through a process of asking them questions, and then they actually start understanding what questions that they should be asking that they didn't know they should ask. And it educates themselves. So what we try to do is empower these individuals to be able to make a decision based on educating them rather than being told this is what you should buy. Nobody likes to be told anything, especially not a successful, smart, powerful person. So that's our really main objective, is educating the client enough to make sure they know why they're buying what they're buying.
And can you take us a little bit through that process? So so I've come to you and I want a jet. So what do we do next?
So basically, there's a number of questions that I would ask them. The first one is, of course, what's your budget? That's a very important thing. And a lot of times the ego will respond, oh, there's no budget. I have no budget. But there's always a budget. I mean, people want to say that to be a big shot, but there is always a budget. And then the questions are basically how old of an airplane that you feel safe enough to fly in. There's really no safety factor on the older airplanes. It's just a matter of maintenance cost. How many people you want to carry, and what's the maximum range that you're going to need to achieve on a trip 4 or 5 times a year. So if you're living in London, let's say, and you go to China once every 6 months, but you go to Nice, every week, you don't buy an airplane to go to China. Of course you can, but we basically show the client what is the minimum you should get, and then everything above that you can do with safely achieving the parameters that you're trying to reach.
So then the size of the jet, basing it on the distance, I suppose, can all jets go all distances? It's just that they have to refuel more frequently, or certain jets can't just go that long haul? Sure.
I mean, any airplane could fly around the world, but sometimes there's a limitation on the equipment that they have and the requirements you need to fly. So if you want to fly across the North Atlantic, let's say, if you don't have certain equipment, they'll make you fly much further north and outside of the normal, if you call airways or auto routes of all the airline. And so the problem is if you don't have the right equipment, they'll stick you out much further north. You have to go further out of your way where there's no traffic, and you won't get in anybody's way. If you have the more sophisticated current equipment, you can fly in a much more narrow pathway, and you can fly the more direct routes.
And by equipment, is that communication equipment and radars, or is it something to do with wind? I'm trying to pretend I know what I'm talking about here.
No, the more current equipment is in avionics, which is navigation and reporting equipment. And of course, today, most people and most pilots, they're not really flying the airplanes, they're computer operators. So they, as soon as they lift off the ground, they push a button and the autopilot takes over. So the newer systems today are actually talking to the air traffic control, and they're reporting where they are, and they're making sure that they don't collide with each other. I'm saying that facetiously, but in a way, it reports that the airplanes are staying their distance apart from each other, different altitudes, and it does this all automatically, autonomously, so you don't need human error. And that's how anything happens badly in this world, is because you have human error, not because it's a computer error.
And then going back to sort of educating the buyer on the things that they need to consider once they've actually decided on a plane, then what is the management that you need to take into consideration as an owner of a jet?
So it's quite different from America versus the rest of the world. In America, since most of the time people flying in the U.S., it's a big place, and there's no customs or immigration issue like that. So it's much easier to fly around the U.S. So 90% of the people who own airplanes, or corporations who own airplanes in the U.S., actually have their own in-house flight department, and they don't really go to an external management company. Opposite, you get outside the U.S., and 90% of the airplanes are actually managed by a management company, a third-party management company that has really the expertise to be able to have multicultural negotiations with different authorities and different landing requirements and language requirements and customs requirements, things like that. So it's much more complicated flying internationally, and it's harder to have one in-house flight department do that. So they use third-party management companies to actually oversee that, who are companies who manage multiple airplanes and have the ability to have the infrastructure to support cross-border much easier than having a single flight department.
So then management goes in two parts. One is actually moving the plane around and dealing with the administration of arriving and leaving and so on. And then I guess there's the other part where you've got to make sure that you're hiring the right pilots and that you're maintaining your jet, the fuel consumption. Is it divided, or can you just go to one company and they have different departments that deal with all of it?
Yeah, so the kind of pilot or flight department or management company is going to be very different depending on what your needs are. So if you have an airline pilot, for example, that airline pilot just shows up to the airplane. It's already been pre-flighted. It's already been filled with fuel. It's been checked for maintenance. Everything is done, and the pilot just walks into the airline terminal, walks on the airplane, has his flight plan handed to him, and basically pushes the button, starts the engine, and goes. Very simple. Now, if you have a corporate pilot, you don't have that infrastructure around you, so you have to really file the flight plan, check the weather, check the airport you're going to, making sure you have the right fuel. Go around the airplane to make sure that the maintenance has been done, all of that kind of thing. And then even more intricately, if you're going to fly from London to, say, Sri Lanka or to Ghana or someplace like that, you have to really be resourceful when you get there, who your resources are going to be and how you're going to have the landing, the steps coming up to the plane, the fuel, the catering, all that kind of stuff. It's not flying New York to Paris or to London. You really have to be resourceful because you're in the middle of no place, and you have to know the right sources to do that. So there are three completely different kind of people and teams that you need to be around you.
Okay. Now, we talked about who uses private jets, and it is mainly corporates, and it is going to be the sort of top executives in those corporates. So there is kind of a little bit of a crossover between using it as work or for leisure, but it's all driven by work. So what is that market? How many people are we looking at?
Well, there's about 22,000 jets in the whole world, and it's broken out pretty heavily in America. It's 14,000 of the 22,000. And the rest of the world is dispersed. So there's about 15-20% of the jets, about 3,000 are in Europe. There's probably about 5% in all of Africa and about 5% all of Asia and about 10% are in the Middle East. So that's the distribution of where the airplanes are placed. But as far as what kind of people or companies own these airplanes, there's a small amount, obviously, of governments, and all the rest are companies. So you might have some more entrepreneurial-led companies that have airplanes, and it's just the person, the chairman or the CEO or the owner, if it's a public or private company, who actually flies in it with his staff or his family or his team. But you don't ever see an airplane purchased just for personal use. And also it's a matter of how much you fly is if you buy an airplane or not. Because if you're not flying more than 150 hours a year, you really should not own an airplane. It's just too much work, it's too expensive, and it's not that over 150 hours it's cheaper to fly privately, but logistically it's much easier to be able to move around and have it, rather than chartering an airplane and have to call and find one all the time. So there is a break point of where you should buy and where you shouldn't. Of course, that takes into consideration that you have the financial wherewithal to be able to fly on a corporate aircraft. Because if it's really going to change your life financially, don't do it.
And talking about the financials, so are there more efficient ways of owning and buying airplanes and holding them, financing them, that people should consider?
Well, some people who don't fly enough, and they still want to have an airplane for the security, for the privacy, and the comfort of knowing who your pilot is and the maintenance that's been done on that airplane. You can just fly yourself for 150, 200 hours a year, let's say, and then you can rent the aircraft out to third parties for 100, 200, 300 hours a year. And it not only keeps the airplane busy, but it also reduces the amount of cost that you would be having the airplane as the owner. Right,
and then I suppose for a corporate, they can also consider buying the airplane in one entity, renting it to another entity and trying to use some tax benefits, or there were some tax benefits recently in the US. Can you tell us a bit more about those?
So if you look at ownership of an aircraft from a tax standpoint, there are different ways you can sort of minimize the costs by offsetting your taxes. So if you're an American taxpayer, there's depreciation allowance. So Donald Trump put in a tax law about 2.5, 3 years ago that if you buy the airplane in a specific year, you can write off 100% or depreciate 100% of the purchase price of that airplane the first year you buy the airplane. In other places, what you do is basically the airplane is purchased in a special purpose vehicle, and even if it's me personally or my company who wants to use the airplane, there'll be a separate company who will own that airplane, and I or my company will rent the airplane from that company. So it becomes an operating expense to my company, just like any other operating expense in the business.
So I guess it's safe to say that, most of the people who consider using private jets are billionaires.
No, that's not completely true. Since there's only about 3,000 billionaires in the world and there's 22,000 jets in the world, the math does not
Right.
add up to that. So it's really corporates use the airplanes. And yes, there are some billionaires who run corporations, but they're the ones who probably built the corporations. And they're not using them for fun and games, because really the people who are CEOs of the major corporations, the multimillionaire, billionaire kind of people, they're really on, if you want them to say on, meaning doing business 24/7. In any social event, they're thinking in their head some business angle to the conversation of the person that they're talking to, or they go into a nice, beautiful area or resort, but there are other corporate or wealthy people in that area. And there's always a reason that besides for just having fun, there's always a business reason that's usually tied to that trip. Of course, on a weekend, they'll end up in some place that's close by where they're at. But the majority of people who are owning airplanes are corporations that use them for corporate use to create time, manufacture time, and be more flexible in their day.
Okay. So we've said that, having a jet in America is more commonplace, and it's easier to get around the airports. And what you were saying is that in America there's so much airspace, airports. Can we just talk a little bit about that?
So America's been flying around in corporate jets since the early 1960s. So they've been doing it for more than 50 years, and it's so much easier to fly. You can pull your car up to an airplane, you get in, somebody takes your car away, you take off. There's no aggravation. In Europe, it's much more difficult, because there's usually the security issue, there's the terrorism issue, there's the cross-border issue, immigration. So usually, most of the time, you can't actually drive your car up to an airplane unless you're escorted out and things like that. And the ability to fly cross-border complicates things also. As far as in America, there's 5,000 airports that you can land a corporate jet in. And in a place, let's say, like China, which is on the other end of the spectrum, and even though the landmass is about the same with the U.S. as it is in China, 5,000 airports in America, there's about 130 airports in all of mainland China that you can land a corporate jet at. So the flexibility of where you can travel is much less. And on top of that, in some place, let's say like China, the airspace is controlled 70% by the military. So the ability and the flexibility of an owner of an aircraft to travel around China is much more limited, because you're at the whim of the military to allow you through that space or not. And just in general, America's much more capitalistic in its viewpoint of people and corporations who own airplanes, whereas someplace, whether it's in Europe, and, more socialist-minded, or in China, more communist-minded, it's much stricter. And they're more suspect of people who own corporate jets and corporations who own corporate jets. And people don't want to buy a corporate jet because they don't want to be put under a microscope, or thinking that there's any kind of corruption, or how they made their money. So there's just less people who are willing in some of those countries to actually fly private. And I actually gave T-shirts away at one of the aircraft shows because I hate this idea. And my pitch on the back of the T-shirt was, "Stop apologizing for your success. Buy a jet."
And you also have your own tagline for ultra-high net worth individuals.
So the definition of a ultra-high net worth individual is a person who's worth more than $30 million US. But you have 500,000 of those people in the world. And they could be worth 30 million, a billion, 10 billion, but they don't have the mindset to actually spend the money on flying on a private aircraft. So I coined the term the ultra-high jet worth individual, which is somebody who has the financial capability, but actually has the mindset, in addition to that, to spend the money on the quality of life and fly privately.
Right, okay. Now, I know that I would feel very comfortable buying a jet from someone who actually learnt to fly at the age of 14. Talk us about how you came about developing your bespoke software and what it does for a customer.
So going back to the early days when I started selling airplanes, which was I don't know, like 40 years ago, 80% of all the jets were in America, and 19% of the jets were in Europe, and there was 1% in the rest of the world. I left the aircraft industry for quite a while, and I got into the mergers and acquisitions and private equity, corporate takeovers things for about 20 years. When I came back into the industry, the whole demographic distribution of the corporate jet ownership has changed. And instead of 80% being in America, it was only 50% in America. And all of these new emerging and frontier markets came about that was starting to be developed, and they started having corporate jets. So places like Russia or China, you know, or Africa, where you had supermarkets that never even had a loaf of bread on the supermarket shelves, now were these big developing countries, and they were buying jets. So when I was in America in my early days, I can easily get on an airplane and fly to go see a client in 2 hours and meet with them and come back. But when I decided to get back into the industry 10 years ago, the whole demographic distribution of these corporations changed. And now I couldn't just fly to China or to Russia or to Africa for one day for a meeting. It was financially, it was definitely not worth it. And also you can get there and they can cancel a meeting. So I wanted to come up with a crazy idea. How do I get these clients to come and see me? So I asked about 10 people the idea I had about building a showroom and getting a client to come to talk to us about buying a jet. Pretty much everybody told me that I should check into a psychiatric hospital, that, you know, to open up a shop to sell jets was the most ridiculous thing they ever heard. But of course, everything is a crazy idea the day before somebody actually does it. And so I came up with an idea. I'm going to build a showroom. And in that showroom, not only do you have to have something fancy in the window to get them in, but once you get them in, you need to have technology, because everybody today just wants everything to touch their finger on a piece of glass and voila, magic happens and you get information. So after you have the technology, you have to have information and data. So I created this app that basically, once somebody did come into the showroom, I was able to keep their interest and educate them, whether it was a pilot, whether it was a high net worth individual, whether it was a diplomat or a celebrity. Everybody would have to be engaged and interested in what this app did. And the app actually does exactly that. It engages a person, it educates them, and every single person gets personal attention by going through the app, because it depends on their inputs that you'll get the output. And it tells them exactly what they need that meets their needs by putting in the parameters that they require.
So one thing that is a big topic these days in the corporate world is sustainability, and it feels like an odd question to ask somebody who's running the jet business, but how has that impacted your world?
Yeah, the carbon footprint is something that somebody always looks at the corporate jet user and says, oh, how can you be spending this money and talking about saving the planet and flying around on a private jet? It's ironic, because actually the whole airline industry is 2% of the whole carbon footprint problem. And the corporate jet market is 2% of the 2%. So it's 0.04% of the global problem is the corporate jet market. It's something like the cows give off 17% of the problem, okay? And they're not really contributing to the economy of the world. But the cost for most corporate owners to offset that carbon footprint degradation of the atmosphere is minor. And most actually users are actually paying into a carbon footprint fund that offsets any negative input they do to the atmosphere by either that money going to building new plants that have regenerative energy, or to plant trees in different places of the world, or there are different funds that are actually adapted to take money from these people to offset the carbon that they're putting into the atmosphere. So they're very conscious about this.
So basically, in real estate in America, there's a multi-listing system, and unfortunately here in the UK, anybody with a phone can call themselves a real estate professional. How does it work in the aviation world?
Yeah, in the aviation world versus the real estate world, as far as anybody being able to broker or sell airplanes, it's actually worse than the real estate market. What they call bedroom brokers. In the old days in America, we used to call it anybody with a roll of quarters and a payphone could sell an airplane. It's pretty much the same today. There is no certification, there's no accreditation, there's no teaching, there's no class, there's nothing like that in our world. And there's not even a set commission rate that's agreed to. So it's really what you can get, what you can negotiate with your client is what you're going to make. And there are definitely tons of people who just want to go on the internet and find an airplane for sale. And it's quite hilarious because I could see these super smart, successful billionaires, CEOs of corporations, and they go on the internet searching for airplanes for sale. I sort of tell them it's like if you want to get married, you're going to go on the internet and find that gorgeous Russian blonde that describes her, and when she shows up in America, it's going to be exactly as described. It's ridiculous. And what you see on the internet today is not what you get in so many different ways. So you need the real intelligence. You need to pay for that intelligence, and it's going to save you a lot in the aftermarket of owning an airplane. So we have a full staff of researchers, and all they do is call every owner of every jet and every new registration of a new aircraft that gets bought or a pre-owned one that gets traded. We track down who the actual person or company is behind that special purpose vehicle that's registered in some offshore country. So we actually talk to the principals, we talk to the pilots, and we get all of the actual technical data and find out the maintenance history, the pedigree, if you had any damage history, the pricing, all of that kind of thing. And so we have a very, very comprehensive amount of information on anything we represent to sell or clients that we're looking to buy for. And as in real estate, you don't drive down the street and see a sign, oh, house for sale, let me call that person. Do you really think the only reason you're going to do that is because you're going to save a commission from a broker who really knows the market everywhere in that whole area? It's quite ridiculous. And there's certain things in life you don't want to buy the cheapest stuff. You don't want to go out to a restaurant and try to find the cheapest sushi restaurant, right? There's certain things in the world that you don't want to buy the cheapest of. You're not going to negotiate with your surgeon before surgery, And you're going to fly in a private jet. You're going to have your life, your family's life, your executive's life. Why would you sit there and try to find the cheap way to do that? Wouldn't you want to be more confident that you have got every I dotted and T crossed on the history of the airplane, the maintenance? Yes, of course you want to don't get the best purchase and best price, but you need to be smart about it, just like you would do in the real estate. But it's a little bit more gambling with your life in an airplane, and it's really stupid that they have these people who try to save a little money and don't go to a professional who really knows what they're doing in this industry.
Yes, and that's what enables you to have so much data to compare on your great app that you've got there.
Yes, and the investment we've made here in this showroom does not exist anywhere in the world. Nobody's done anything like this. So to take somebody through this process doesn't exist anywhere in the world. Everybody has their own biased reason for trying to pitch a certain airplane for sale because they represent that airplane for sale. We are actually just saying, listen, we want you to engage us to represent you, whether you're buying or selling. We'll put that hat on and we'll act on your best interest. That's what we want to do. And we're not trying to just sell you anything. We're trying to sell you what you need and what you want, not what I want to sell you.
And last but not least, how has COVID affected the market?
COVID's affected the market pretty drastically because there, again, as I was talking about previously, there were people who couldn't afford to fly private, but mentally couldn't get comfortable spending that kind of money to fly private. The COVID situation actually pushed them over that line. And now they realize, I don't want to be in a cabin of 300 people of coughing and kids coughing, and it's just recirculating that air. Even if you're wearing a mask, it's not going to actually protect you. Where in a corporate jet, you're in your own atmosphere, and you're actually bringing in fresh air from the outside and circulating that fresh air through the cabin. On an airliner, on a commercial airliner, they're mostly just recirculating the air, because if they bring fresh air into the airplane, it burns more fuel and it costs them more money. So most airlines don't actually bring the fresh air in, they're just recirculating and filtering the air. So it's not as clean as in a corporate jet where you're bringing outside air in. So the flexibility of travel, it took us many, many years to have to get through this TSA, this ridiculous security hassle and inconvenience of having to strip down every time walking through one of these metal detectors, and it's so invasive. Now, not only do you have to do that, now you have to deal with COVID. You have to fill out all these forms, and you have to get these tests, and you have to wear masks, and you have to stay social distance, and all of that is just an aggravation where people say, you know what, I can afford this. I'm not going to aggravate myself anymore, and that has positively impacted the corporate jet market.
I bet. Thank you very much for speaking to us. That was really fascinating, and looking forward to trying one of the PJs soon.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to the London Property Podcast. Head over to londonproperty.co.uk and subscribe to our newsletter to receive latest updates.